The first sonnet that we're going to read is Sonnet 73. It's a Shakespearean sonnet. So hopefully you watched the video about what a sonnet is and how it's structured. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to label the rhyme scheme first. We're going to divide it up into the quatrains and the couplet. And you should know all these terms if you watch the video. So doing rhyme scheme, you're always looking at the last rhyme, okay? So the first line is always A, so behold is A. Then you're going to go to the second line. Hang does not rhyme with behold, so it goes to B. Cold rhymes with behold, so we're going back to A. And then sang rhymes with hang, so that's going to be B. All right. Now let's go to the next line. Day doesn't rhyme with anything so far, so we're going to go to the next letter of the alphabet, C. West does not rhyme with anything, so D. Away and day rhyme, so we're going to go back to C. Rest and west rhyme, so we're going to be at D. Now let's go on to fire. So fire doesn't rhyme with anything, so we're going to go to E. Lie does not rhyme with anything, so that's going to be F. Expire and fire rhyme, so that's going to be E. Buy and lie rhyme, so that's going to be F. Now notice that buy and lie are not spelled the same at the end. It doesn't have to be the same spelling, it has to be the same sound. It has to rhyme. And then strong and long rhyme with each other, but they do not rhyme with anything so far. All right, so let's go ahead and divide it into the quatrains and the couplet. So each Shakespearean sonnets are divided into 3 quatrains and a couplet, and you're going to see the change in rhyme, because a quatrain is 4 lines of poetry combined by rhyme scheme. So A B, those go together. Then it changes to C, D. That's the end of quatrain 2. E F is quatrain 3. And then you've got your couplet at the end. So this is quatrain 1, quatrain 2, quatrain 3, and your couplet. So what is the point? And you're going to see as we read these, there's a reason to be able to do rhyme scheme and to be able to divide into parts like quatrains, couplets, or octave and sestets. So what each one of these does, each quatrain develops a metaphor. So each quatrain develops a metaphor. All right, so each quatrain develops a metaphor. So as we read this, we're going to break it into quatrains so that we can look at each metaphor. And so what he does is he is going to compare himself, the metaphor compares himself to 3 different things. So I'm going to at first identify what he compares himself to in each quatrain, and then we're going to look at some of the details. So he says, that time of year thou mayst in me behold. So what he's doing is he's comparing his life, his entire life, not just this stage of his life, to a year in the first quatrain. So when we read the first quatrain, we're going to be looking at what details tell us what time of year it is. Because he says the time of year, but his entire life is being compared to a year. All right, so let's look at the second stanza. In me thou seest the twilight of such day. So the twilight of such day is what he's comparing himself to at the moment, but his entire life is being compared to a day. And then the third quatrain, in me thou seest the glowing of such fire. So the glowing of such fire, but his entire life is being compared to a fire. So what we're going to do is as we read this and we look at the details, we're going to look at what time of year does he describe himself as? What time of day does he describe himself? what stage of the fire does he describe himself? So we're going to look at the details. And from those details, we're going to figure out, we're going to write over to the side what he's comparing himself to. So with the first quatrain, we're looking at the time of year. He says, you will see in me, thou mayest in me behold, meaning in me you're going to see a time of year. But what time is it? We've got yellow leaves, or none, or few, upon the boughs which shake against the cold. Then he says, where late the sweet birds sang. Now, late the sweet birds sang means in the past. I'm going to put that, past. Meaning they're no longer here. So in the past, the birds were singing. So if you've got yellow leaves, which the yellow leaves probably give you the greatest hint, but the yellow leaves help you to see the time of year. But we also get a little bit more detail because we know that it's getting cold. And we know that the birds are no longer there. So it's not just that we've got the yellow leaves, but the cold tells us a little bit more detail. But what time of year? And let's think in terms of seasons. So what season is he talking about? He's talking about fall, right? And not just is it fall, but if it's cold and there are maybe none or few leaves on the trees, so they're not full of yellow leaves. Some of them might not have any. Some of them have very few. We know that it's starting to get cold, so it's not just fall, but we get that it's late fall, right? Okay. Okay, so with Quatrain 2, we're going to be looking at what time of day is he comparing his life. Well, the first hint that we get is twilight. And if you don't know what twilight is, twilight, there's a morning and an evening twilight, but we're going to see in just a second that it says after sunset. So we know that he's talking about evening twilight, and twilight is just where you don't see the sun, but you can see light from the sun. So in an evening twilight, the sun has gone down. You can't actually see the sun, but you still see light from the sun. So he says that there's twilight after sunset fadeth in the west. Then he says, by and by black night doth take away. Now, be careful when you look at this detail, because some people will see the black night and they think that it's nighttime, that it's dark. But when he says by and by, that means eventually, or it's coming. So black night is not there yet, it's coming. So, or in by and by can mean soon. So we know that it's evening twilight and that black night will be taking away all of the light very soon. All right, let's look at the third quatrain. He says that there's the glowing of such fire, that on the ashes of his youth doth lie. So we've got some ashes, but there's still a small glow left. The deathbed whereon it must expire. So the fire will expire soon. The deathbed, by the way, is the ashes. All right, and then consumed by that which it was nourished by just means that, the flame nourishes the fire and the wood nourishes the fire, but it's consumed from the flame. So he's telling us the glowing of such fire. So what we get here is the embers. The embers, glowing embers. All right, and let me go back up to Quatrain 2, so twilight. So we've got the first quatrain is the late fall. The second quatrain, he's comparing his stage of life to twilight. And in the third quatrain, he's comparing his life to the embers, because he says the glowing of such fire on a bed of ashes. So if we are to think about the stages that he's describing as his life right now, you can see that he's nearing the end, right? Let's think about what, if you think in terms of seasons, and you said, okay, well, the seasons are going to be compared to a person's life. Well, what is, which one's going to represent birth, young, youth, old age, and death? All right, so let's think about that. And I'm going to pull up another slide, and we're going to think about what these different stages and seasons could represent. All right, so let's just look at what these quatrains could represent in the 4 stages of life. So birth, being a baby, is going to be that first stage. Youth, young adulthood. So youth doesn't necessarily have to be just teenager, but we can think about young adulthood as well. Then old age and death. So if we were to think of seasons, so where he's comparing himself to a year, let's think about the seasons that could represent these different stages. So let's look at year first. So with the year, which season would represent birth? Think about, coming to life, new birth, young. The season would be spring, right? Because that's when everything is new, everything is growing and it's fresh. Youth would be that fun time of year, right? So it's summer. All right? So summer would represent youth. Old age is when, all right, think about fall. Because fall, things start to wither, right? Then death would be winter, because in the winter it gets so cold that so many things die. All right? So with that, you can see that he says that his life is in this stage right here. It's in fall. All right, so now let's move on to the next thing, which is, he says, the twilight of such day. So the next thing we're going to look at is where he compares his life to a day. All right, so thinking about, if we were to take a day and when we're thinking of a day, it's the daylight, not necessarily midnight to midnight, okay? But let's think daylight. What would be birth whenever you think of daylight? That would be the sunrise, correct? So sunrise, whenever we first see that light. Then youth, think of like the peak of the day. And youth and young adulthood would be noon or even afternoon. Or, early afternoon. Then old age. I'm going to switch down to death because, whenever death is going to be when there is no light left. So I'm going to put dark night. Okay, so dark night is going to be death. So what is old age going to be? It's going to be getting close to that dark night, but it has to be later than afternoon. So old age is going to be represented by evening. And if you look at how he described himself, he says, the twilight of such day, by and by black night doth take away, which means that very soon he's going to be at that dark night. He's not there yet, but he's close. So he's in that evening stage. Okay? Now let's look at the third quatrain, the last quatrain. And let's take, because in that, he says, he's comparing his life to a fire, right? So if we were to, compare his life to a fire, because that's what he's doing. Let's think about 4 stages of a fire that could represent the 4 stages of life. So, what is that very beginning of a fire? The very beginning of a fire has to be that first spark, right? You have that first spark that eventually becomes the flame. All right, so youth would be the flames. And the very peak would be, when the flames are at their biggest. Then, let's skip over old age and let's go to death. So death is going to be the ashes, right? Where there's no fire left. So it's going to be the cold ashes. So if it has to be between the flames and the cold ashes, we don't want it to just be completely gone. But guess what? Whenever you have those embers in a fire, and you have that glow, and I'll even put glowing. The glowing embers, that's where he is. That's how he describes himself in terms of a fire. So with all of that and all of these metaphors of the year, the day, and the fire, we get that he's in that old age, right? That's what he's trying to say about himself from those metaphors. So as we come back to the poem, we get that he is saying that he's growing old. He's getting close to death, and we get that he's getting close to death because we get that there are very few leaves on the trees. It's starting to get cold. The black night is going to soon take away any light, and then it's there's a small glow on a bed of ashes. So what we need to do on this, the very last part, and by the way, here is your turn. We talk about the turn. This is your turn. This is the shift. Now I'll even write the word shift there. This is your shift in the poem. He says, this thou perceivest. Thou means you. So this thou perceivest, which means see, understand, which makes thy love, this means your love more strong. So he says, yes, you can see this, but it makes your love stronger. To love that well which thou must leave ere means before. So what he says is, you love me more, even though you can see that I'll be gone before long. So, thinking about that, you can go to your notebook and you can fill in the soapstone. Who's the speaker? And it's a man who is, I'm going to get you started, a man who is growing older, nearing death. What's the occasion or the situation? What he's talking to, the one that he loves, and go through there. Who's the audience? Whenever he's saying thou and thy, who is he talking to? All right, and then go ahead. Whenever you get to, you're going to get to the tone, the shift, and the theme. What you do for the theme is you're going to think about which. The theme is the lesson that you learn, the purpose of the poem. So what's the purpose, what's the lesson, what's the theme? All of those kind of mean the same thing. That is, whenever he writes this, what message do you think he's trying to give to everyone else, to his readers? Not just the person he's writing to, but to anyone who gets this. And the best way to do theme is to say, okay, what's the topic? Well, you can see 2 topics, love and growing older. And what does he want us to learn about those topics? All right, and whenever you can tell me what he wants us to learn about the topics of love and growing older, you have your theme. All right, so go ahead and do the soapstone in your notebook. And we're finished with Sonnet 73.